before I talk exclusively about Mojave Desert tortoise, I want to talk a minute about the genus Gopherus. So the Mojave Desert tortoise is part of a complex of, I'll figure it out, I promise. It's part of a complex over here of desert tortoises. But starting here in the east, we have Gopherus polyphemus, which is the gopher tortoise. Now this is a larger tortoise, and it is very fast. This guy can hustle across the landscape. They are associated with long-leaf pine forests. As we move west, we have Burnand, the Texas tortoise. This is the smallest of the Gopherus with a highly domed shell. And they're associated with lolas, or those rolling hummocks with mesquite. They're not as well studied as the other Gopherus species in the United States. And in fact, none of the tortoises in Mexico are very well studied at all. Thank you so much. As we move westward, we get to the Volson tortoise, which is the largest tortoise in the genus, but with the smallest range. They have a really small range in Mexico, very large tortoises, and they're heavily associated with grassland. And then we come to the Mojave Desert tortoise, or the desert tortoise complex. When I started working with desert tortoises, it was thought that there was only one species of desert tortoise, Gopherus agassizii, the Mojave Desert tortoise that ranged all the way from the Mojave down to the Sinaloan. They were subdivided into two species because of the Colorado River right there, which has formed a barrier on the landscape for about 5 million years, so long enough for speciation to occur. Following that, a study was done on the Sonoran, what was then considered the Sonoran Desert tortoise, down into Sinaloa, Mexico. And this makes it look like the range of the Sinaloan tortoise is very large, but it's much patchier than what's depicted here. And it was found that these are separate species. So we have Goodii, Moravkai, and Agassizii. And these three tortoises are difficult to tell apart morphologically. You need to get into morphometrics, unlike the other Gopherus species, which are pretty easy to tell apart if you've looked at enough tortoises. They are, however, genetically distinct and behaviorally distinct. So when we first started making range maps, we often used presence points and expert opinion. So this is a range map for the desert tortoise from 1994 and showing what's estimated to be the range, again, based off of presence points and expert opinion. Now these are good in that they tell us an idea of where the animal can be found, and they give us a sense of the core portion of the range. They are, however, not quantitative, and they're not predictive. And again, there's an important word in there, which is expert opinion, so they're largely based off of opinion. That changed for the desert tortoise in 2009 when my mentor, Dr. Ken Nussir, created a habitat suitability model for desert tortoises using presence, absence points, and 16 environmental covariates. So no more expert opinion. This range map, press the right button?
It's up at top. See, you have to bring it. See the dots up top? It's on the ceiling. It's on the ceiling. You have to oh, there it is.
Actually, it doesn't work on the screen very well.
Oh,
yeah, if you want just a regular point.
Okay.
I had a stick under there someplace. There it is, against, yeah, right against the sign.
Oh boy.
We have a regular
Brings me back to grade
stick.
school.
We've taken them, we kind of take them away from small children, so.
Yeah, that's good. Should I use that one instead of this?
Either way.
Thank you, Julie. Okay. So this is a robust model that is predictive and quantitative. And so some key differences between early range maps and what we have now is that this shows us habitat potential that's closely correlated with population density. So these bright colors here, this is cut off unfortunately, but these bright colors here represent highly suitable habitat where we would expect to find tortoises in high density. Down here in the dark blue, we get to 0 where we don't expect to see any tortoises, and there is no tortoise habitat. Something else I want to point out is that the edge, and what we consider the edge, varies. So here, we don't include Palm Springs or Anza-Borrego. But in this habitat suitability model, we predict that there is suitable habitat connected up into this area of the Mojave, down through Palm Springs and into Anza-Borrego. Another thing I want to point out is how well connected this habitat is across the range. We have a lot of bright colors that go all the way from California through Nevada and into Arizona and Utah. And that's because tortoises evolved in a metapopulation. And a metapopulation is a series of spatially structured populations in heterogeneous habitat, so lots of variable habitat that are all connected via migration. That metapopulation structure for desert tortoises is currently at risk and is deteriorating due to anthropogenic disturbance, largely rapid urbanization in the Southwest, as well as utility-scale solar development. This leads to smaller, more isolated populations that are more at risk for extirpation or local extinction. The Mojave Desert Tortoise was emergency listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act in 1989 due to rapid habitat loss and population declines. Unfortunately, since listing, that trend has continued, particularly in the last decade and a half with the advent of utility-scale solar on the landscape. And in a recent decade, it was estimated that tortoises lost almost 40% of their population. When a species is placed on the endangered species list, a recovery plan is created that includes recovery units. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife has gone through a couple iterations of recovery units. I'm showing you the recovery units from 2011. And what I want to point out on this is that we have these variable recovery units across the landscape. We're probably, for the sake of this talk, most interested in the western Mojave and then this eastern Colorado portion here. But again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife did not include edge populations in these recovery units, except up here in the Virgin River area where they started to include these tortoises a little bit more. Okay, so recovery units are not devoid of development pressures. Development does occur within recovery units, and within those recovery units we have critical habitat units that are smaller designated areas that have less development pressure. It doesn't mean no development occurs, but there is less development pressure. So these are results from a long-term range-wide study of population density called line distance sampling. And these are the numbers of live tortoise observations against a terrestrial development index. These are percentages of development. And what Carter and colleagues found is that about 80%, more water, thank you. About 80% of desert tortoise habitat has some form of development within 1 square kilometer. When we get to about 5%, actually somewhere over 5%, we're not sure exactly where that cutoff is, but somewhere between 5 and 10% development within that 1 square kilometer, we essentially lose tortoises from the landscape. So maintaining protected habitat for the species is very important for long-term persistence. So here I'm showing you again these 2011 recovery units from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and these are what are called genetic units from Bridget Haggerty and Dick Tracy. So when we're talking about a population, what is a population? That's a little bit of a tricky business to define. I could say a population is a group of animals over here that I study, and then I can get in my truck and I can drive over here and say that's another population. It's a little bit arbitrary though. And it sort of sees space in the way that we humans see space rather than the way that animals or plants are actually using it. So as the idea of genetic populations caught on in popularity, studies were done to determine genetic units. And in 2010, Haggerty and Tracy found 3 basal clusters. So we have the California cluster right here, which is the Western Mojave, and then the 2 Colorado units, and then what they call the Las Vegas cluster, and then the Northern Mojave cluster. So these are distinct genetic units, and then they did hierarchical analysis and subdivided those even further. And we can see that the western Mojave and the eastern Mojave align reasonably well with what U.S. Fish and Wildlife has for recovery units. As we move east, it sort of falls apart a little bit. Now, Colorado desert tortoises were found to have a shared mitochondrial haplotype with those in the western Mojave. And that just means that they have sets of closely related genetic markers that are maternally inherited on a chromosome, and they're generally linked. So the fact that the Colorado desert tortoises are closely linked genetically to these western Mojave tortoises indicates large amounts of gene flow and connectivity through these groups. Now, within the Colorado desert, population trends have continued to decline with a roughly 30% population decline and 32,000 acres lost to solar development in the last decade and a half alone. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recommends protecting and maintaining existing populations of desert tortoises in the area to prevent further losses. Oh, I can use the clicker to click it. I keep forgetting. So I'm going to remind you about the metapopulation structure, which is really important for the species persistence. So these are a couple of tortoises on the California-Nevada border. They live in this party burrow with a lot of other tortoises, and we know that because we have equipment attached to these tortoises so that we can track them, and a GPS data logger that records a point every 30 minutes so we can see where they go and who they hang out with. Now, when we're talking about a metapopulation, we know that tortoises don't move terribly far, and home range for a tortoise is about 1 square kilometer. So these tortoises are in contact with each other, and they might be in contact with tortoises within that 1 square kilometer home range, but they're certainly not in contact with tortoises that are on the edge, like in the western Mojave or the Colorado. They are, however, connected to each other in this pattern called isolation by distance, where one tortoise is connected to another, that can mate with another, that's connected to another, in this stepping stone-like pattern of connectivity. And isolation by distance is a form of spatial autocorrelation for anybody who loves statistics out there. And it can tell us a lot about population structure. So these are multi-generational connectivity networks across the landscape. Now, in my work, I looked at relatedness for desert tortoises, and I used first and second order relationships. So an example of a first order relationship would be something like parent to child or full sibling. A second order relationship would be something like grandparent to grandchild or half sibling. And what I found is that there are second order relatives up to 60 kilometers apart on the landscape, which is much larger distance than we had expected for a species that has a 1 square kilometer home range. Now, I can't explain the process that led to this pattern, but I can make some assumptions. So here's one of them. If you have a female tortoise that reaches sexual maturity at 20 years of age, and then she produces 1 clutch of eggs per year for, 30 years, each of those clutches has multiple paternity, so that creates a lot of half siblings. And then after those eggs hatch out, those individuals go through a dispersal phase and move out across the landscape. Something like that could create this multi-generational pattern of second order relatedness that we see here. I'm going to go back to trying the clicker. Yeah, okay. So because maintaining connectivity is so important for tortoises across the range, a few people have looked at this. Roy Averill Murray, formerly with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, took a look at least cost paths. What I'm showing you here, instead of the recovery units, these are just the critical habitat units. So the critical habitat units in the Colorado are down here at the Chuckwalla and Pinto Mountain, and then these are the western Mojave up here, or Broadman and Fremont Kramer and Superior Cronies. And they found least cost paths through these areas, so areas that are likely important for maintaining connectivity across the range. That was in 2013. In 2019, Gray and colleagues used this circuit theory model, which basically applies ideas from the way that current flows to gene flow. And so they created this omnidirectional model that is predicting where there's high levels of gene flow and high levels of historic connectivity on the landscape. What's really interesting to me is that we see this really strong sort of north-south current here from the Colorado up into the western Mojave, and then from the Colorado up into the Mojave right there with this gap in between. But interestingly, neither one modeled Palm Springs or Anza-Borrego, conspicuously left out of all of these modeling efforts. Now, tortoises, when they move, they like to travel along washes. It doesn't mean that they only travel along washes. It just means that they like to. A lot of things like to travel along washes in the deserts. Now, for Mojave Desert tortoises, I found that mountain passes are connective. So they're generally thought of as a valley species that occasionally uses mountains. And in my research, what I found is that mountain passes can provide a large amount of connectivity for tortoises from valley to valley. And in fact, we found very high population densities in some mountain passes. This is the inverse of what you find in the Sonoran Desert tortoise. The Sonoran Desert tortoise is generally thought of as a mountain species where valleys connect the tortoise. So that leads to thinking about what is connective for tortoises and what is a tortoise corridor. Well, a lot of times when we start talking about corridors in biology, we automatically think of passage species. So animals that move quickly across the landscape to get from one habitat area to another habitat area and don't require a lot of resources in between. So things like mountain lions or bighorn sheep. Not so for desert tortoises. Desert tortoises are considered corridor dwellers, which means that the corridor needs to provide most, if not all, life history needs. So that basically means a corridor is just habitat for tortoises. So they might be living at lower population density in a corridor, but they need to be able to live in that corridor. Unless it's a culvert underneath a highway. So culverts underneath highways are short distances that tortoises are able to traverse pretty easily. And this photograph was taken along Interstate 15, and ideally we would have tortoise fencing along the side of the highway that keeps the tortoises off the road so they don't get smashed by all the traffic, that ties in with culverts that go underneath the road, so it kind of funnels them underneath the road. Well, for a time, folks wondered, would tortoises actually use culverts? Probably something like this, but a lot of hydrological culverts are those round corrugated metal culverts. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ran a study off of, I think it was Highway 95 in Nevada, and put wildlife cameras in there, and this is just a subset of some of those pictures, and they saw tortoises moving like crazy back and forth across these across these culverts. So originally it was thought that they wouldn't like to step on that material, but they don't seem to mind it at all. What's important with underpasses, or these hydrological culverts, is that there has to be habitat for tortoises on either side, so that they are moving to and from something in their short distances. Okay, so I'm going to revisit this range map that shows suitable tortoise habitat, again down here through Palm Springs and into Anza-Borrego. And just say that there are natural features on the landscape that fragment populations. It's not just highways and developments, but it can be high elevation mountains and low elevation playas and areas of unsuitable habitat. Notably for the Mojave Desert tortoise, there are two water features that really can be kind of almost thought about as one, which is the Colorado River, which separated the Mojave Desert tortoise from the Sonoran Desert tortoise, and then the Salton Trough, which was formed by the Colorado River. So the Salton Trough, which this area sort of shows historic Lake Cahuilla, was formed by periodic, infrequent but periodic inundation from the Colorado River, from overflow of the Colorado River. And it created this low trough that is thought to serve as a barrier to gene flow. There's no suitable tortoise habitat predicted in the area of Lake Cahuilla or the Salton Trough. So it leads to the question of what the true edge is. And because of that Salton trough, a lot of models and a lot of folks have considered the true edge to be along the edge of the Salton Sea as we approach that edge, which is why we see recovery units that end there, as well as models that cut off those edge populations and end in that area. But edges are really important areas. They change over time, and they're predicted to continue to change over time, especially with climate change predictions. Edges are areas of marginal habitat. So we expect to have lower population densities and really difficult habitat conditions for a species that's already living in really difficult habitat conditions. But they also have a tendency to be more adaptive. So the species living on edges generally have more adaptive potential than those at the core of their range. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Anjana Parantaman, created these future habitat models for desert tortoises. And this is one of the models that she created. She used habitat suitability and modeled it against variable climate and land use scenarios. So this is one of the more severe climate change scenarios, but I think that it illustrates what I'm trying to say here rather well, which is, along with seeing that habitat is predicted to move north, we really are starting to lose that metapopulation structure across the landscape. And what we see are the remaining areas of habitat sort of start to look stringy and fragmented with a lot of edge on them, sort of like the tortoises in Palm Springs and Anza-Borrego, which means that these could be very interesting tortoises to study in order to evaluate what we would expect populations might look like in the future. Now this is the new SEER model with current predicted habitat that doesn't include any human disturbance. And these arrows here indicate areas where Anjana and another colleague, Nathan Beyer, found higher than expected levels of genetic diversity for desert tortoises. And that's on the edge of the range up here in the Virgin River area, and then over here in the western Mojave, and then down here near the border, or near the edge of the Colorado River. They did not collect any samples from this western edge right here. But finding those higher than expected levels of genetic diversity is really hopeful and very interesting, because it indicates that these edge populations have more adaptive or evolutionary potential to evolve with changing conditions. So connectivity and edge habitats are important in a metapopulation. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service originally created critical habitat units and tortoise conservation areas, they did not consider connectivity. That was an error on their part. However, they did the best with the available information, because at the time, no one could foresee a future in which all of this public land was going to be converted into different uses. And no one was studying connectivity for the desert tortoise. So the concepts of corridor dwellers and connectivity for these types of species were just being considered. But what I want to say is they also didn't include edge habitats like Palm Springs or Anza-Borrego, and that too may have been an error. Now, tortoises are very well adapted as reptiles to life in the desert. They have hard shells, thick scales, and they lay hard-shelled eggs. Little guys like to hang out in rat holes very near to their natal burrow where they hatched from. So they will generally move 100 to 200 meters and then hang out in these little holes. As adults, they rely heavily on burrows, spending upwards of 80% of their lives underground as a way to conserve water and resources. They are obligate herbivores, and they have really amazing bladders. So the tortoise bladder can constitute up to 40% of its body weight when full. They use their bladder as water storage systems and can recycle water through their system, concentrating it down over and over, and go for about 2 years without water. Right? That's amazing. Tortoises know where these shallow depressions are on the landscape that will hold water in a rainfall event. And if there aren't any near their burrow, they go out and they use those strong forelimbs to build them. And when it starts to rain, as long as it's not so cold that they can't move, they march out, they stick their head in water, and they don't bring it up for a very long time. They take these deep, desperate gulps and do not come up for air because they're trying to fill their bladder. Tortoises also have delayed maturity. They reach sexual maturity at about 15 to 20 years of age. They're long-lived. Estimates are about 80 years. And they have low egg production, relatively speaking, so a clutch is about 6 eggs. All of these make them susceptible to additive mortality, especially if we're losing adults and adult females on the landscape, which we are. So we can use genetics as a tool in conservation to incorporate ideas of population and landscape in order to assign individuals to populations of origin, see where they came from, because people like to move tortoises around on the landscape, and see whether or not we see differentiation between groups, to assess gene flow, evaluate the influence of landscape, both natural features and anthropogenic features like highways and developments, and determine genetic diversity to evaluate populations that we might need to include in conservation efforts to maintain gene flow between those groups that have more genetic diversity and those that are more central into the core area. Now, I'm not the only person that studies tortoise genetics in the Coachella Valley. Jeff Lovich with USGS looked at desert tortoises. This green star right here, these are the Palm Springs tortoises that he looked at. And interestingly, what he found is that, it shifted him over. Interestingly, what he found is that the groups that he studied down here in the Colorado assigned genetically to the Colorado tortoises, but the Palm Springs tortoises did not. They actually assigned to the Western Mojave. So he anticipates that there is a genetic break. It's probably not a true, like, very hard break, because we already have those for tortoises, but reduced levels of gene flow somewhere in here, and he proposes that recovery units be extended out to include those Palm Springs tortoises because they do not appear to be exclusively from an introduced origin, but rather well connected to the tortoises in the Western Mojave. Jeff Manning, formerly with Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, started to do something similar with tortoises here. So he went out and collected genetic samples from desert tortoises in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park and then documented the very convoluted history of tortoises in the area. So Marshall South, who homesteaded out here for a while, reported having seen no desert tortoises in Anza-Borrego. He also reported seeing no bighorn sheep. His children, pictured here with desert tortoises, all of those tortoises were found elsewhere when they were on their travels in more central portions of the range and brought home as pets to Anza-Borrego, so not native tortoises that they found. In the 1970s, the state park released desert tortoises that were pets into areas of the state park, and Manning documented that using records that he found and old news clippings. I do want to say, though, that this story, having a state park release tortoises, is interesting, but it's not that unusual for tortoises. Tortoises are really cute, and they're really slow, and they're really easy to catch. So when you see a tortoise, lots of people really gravitate towards them, and it's not an uncommon story for people to pick them up and move them around on the landscape. Over in the eastern portion of their range near Zion, Boy Scouts released a bunch of tortoises in that area. In the central portion of the range on the border of California and Nevada, thousands of tortoises have been released. that were pet desert tortoises. And if you went and did a survey of folks living in LA, San Diego, or Las Vegas, you'd find that a lot of people have tortoises in their backyards that may or may not have been picked up along roadways. So it's not uncommon for tortoises to be moved. But what Manning found in his preliminary, this is very preliminary genetic work, is that pattern of isolation by distance. That's that stepping stone-like pattern of connectivity. We wouldn't expect to see that pattern in a bunch of random individuals that came from a lot of different areas across the range, right? We would see assignments to different areas rather than this pattern. He also assigned those tortoises, again, this is preliminary, to tortoises in the western Mojave, up through those Palm Springs tortoises, in exactly the areas where we would predict tortoise habitat to be. And here's where he found his tortoises. Now this is, the polygon is overlaid on the habitat suitability model, but you can see that it's in areas that are predicted to have high levels of habitat suitability, so we would expect to find tortoises there naturally. And here is Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. This is adapted from Ken Nusier. It's in Manning's technical report. And these dark areas are areas that are expected to have good tortoise habitat and tortoises in those areas. They also happen to be areas where tortoises were released by rangers, coincidentally, or maybe not. So just to wrap this all up, as I said, tortoises evolved in a metapopulation. And when we think about a metapopulation, it's really important to consider connectivity as well as edge and core populations, right? So maintaining connectivity through that area. Recovery units for tortoises have changed through time since the 90s as we gather new information. And they may eventually include areas here in the blue that are not currently considered in recovery units. And why that's important for Anza-Borrego Desert State Park is, first of all, there's been very little work done on these tortoises. Other than Manning, that's pretty much it. It would be great to know whether or not we're looking at populations of tortoises that have higher levels of genetic diversity, and also to see how those tortoises look in terms of their behavior, their population density, and their genetics, because it can give us an indication of what future populations of tortoises might look like in the central portion of their range. We also expect that we would find gene flow from these tortoises up to tortoises in the north through connected habitat. Given that tortoises are declining range-wide, it's important to maintain protected habitat that is connected for this species. So even though Palm Springs and Anza-Borrego Desert State Park has a thin connectivity, functional connectivity corridor up into the western Mojave, Anza-Borrego Desert State Park does provide protection for the species, just as it functions as a state park. So because tortoises are here, even though you're unlikely to run across them unless you're up in Coyote Canyon or Vallecito or in some of these areas, I just wanted to go over what to do and what not to do should you see a tortoise. Don't touch a tortoise. So there are a couple of really important reasons. One is that amazing bladder that I talked about. So tortoises have two defense mechanisms, essentially. They tuck into their shell and look like a rock, or they void their bladder. And if a tortoise voids its bladder and it doesn't rain soon, you could have costed its water supply. So that's one reason not to touch a tortoise. Another is because of the potential spread of disease. So we carry diseases that don't impact or affect us at all, but we can carry them from our pets at home or from other things we come into contact with into wild populations. And a good example of this is chytrid in amphibians. So researchers were actually responsible for spreading a lot of chytrid to different amphibian populations by not disinfecting a tortoise. Taking a tortoise out of the wild might mean that that individual tortoise is living in someone's backyard very happy and healthy, but it's biologically dead. It's no longer contributing to the gene pool or to the local population, and that is further causing declines. And then finally, don't move a tortoise unless it's to move it out of harm's way. So if you see a tortoise in a road, any kind of road, please move it out of the road. This actually even includes mountain bike trails, because when tortoises tuck into their shell, mountain bikers will see them often as rocks and hit them at high speeds, which doesn't usually cause instant mortality, but it often causes enough shell damage to be problematic for the animal later. So when you move a tortoise, you just want to move it low to the ground in this really awkward way in the direction that it was heading, so that you get it safely off the road.
So that's the only time you want anyone to touch them.
Yeah, unless you're authorized by U.S. Fish and
Whatever, I
Wildlife
mean,
Service.
people like us.
Yeah. So you do want to move a tortoise out of harm's way. You do want to check your tires, especially if you're in a desert area where your vehicle might be providing the only shade around. It's uncommon, but not unheard of, for tortoises to come and seek out that shade and tuck up underneath tires. In my 20 plus years of working with tortoises, I've seen it happen twice, I think. So it's not very common, but it is a good idea. You want to drive slowly, because again, tortoises look like rocks. And if you think about it, get a location and contact me, because I want to know where these tortoises are that folks are finding in Anza-Borrego and in local areas. And with that, I want to end it by showing you some pictures of Anza-Borrego tortoises right here. So these are tortoises, photographs that Manning took. Those tortoises were marked with an ID tag, and they did find a lot of little tortoises. So there is evidence of recruitment out here in Anza-Borrego. And with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Is there a way to develop solar arrays so that it doesn't mess up the habitat, or so that it allows a corridor? I suppose if a tortoise can get through, a person with ill intent could get through, but.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way that I would answer that question is rooftops. But that is not often considered feasible, because the legislation that we have currently is such that the longer the transmission line, the greater the federal subsidy. So a lot of the solar facilities that I worked at were on the California-Nevada border, technically in California, and they were feeding cities in Southern California. So over 250 miles of transmission line, with an estimated 40 to 60% loss of energy produced. But that leads to greater federal subsidies. And that's because we have on the books these regulations for coal, right? That we don't want a coal plant like right next to the city, because it could be dangerous. So unless we start changing those regulations and moving solar closer to urbanization, there are some things that people are playing around with. Currently, when utility scale solar goes in, the first thing that happens is it's bladed and graded, essentially because the soils become compacted, and then it's completely fenced. There are some solar facilities that are playing around with the idea of having a corridor, and so one of my colleagues studied movement of tortoises through this corridor area. It's actually in Nevada, called Silver State, and the solar facility has one block, and then that's completely fenced, and then native Mojave desert vegetation, and then another block that's completely fenced. And he found that tortoises do use those corridors, and that one is, I want to say like 700 meters long, so it's a pretty long corridor, but tortoises can live in it at low densities. The other thing is folks are starting to look at the idea of not fencing these solar facilities, and I'm not sure what's going on with this one, but there's a facility called Genesis in Nevada, I believe it's Genesis, where they have some sections that are completely unfenced. So to see whether or not tortoises will use it, because some folks hypothesize that if we have these solar panels, they could provide shade structure and some protection for younger tortoises to be able to move around them. There's another facility, Ivanpah, that's going to be shut down, well, I think PG&E is backed out of it because of energy loss. And that was solar, or that was hydrothermal? No, solar thermal? No. Hydro solar. Okay, that was a facility that wasn't photovoltaic. Let me try this again. It was big mirrors that focused up on 3 towers. You can see it from Interstate 15, and I worked around this facility pretty extensively, so I should know how to say it correctly. But that one is completely fenced. They translocated, I want to say, almost 200 tortoises off of that 14 square kilometer area. It was estimated that it was going to be like 20 tortoises by whoever originally did the surveys. But they did not blade and grade that facility. So when you go inside the fence line and walk around, there still is a lot of native vegetation. It's completely fenced, so tortoises can't access it, but there is a lot of native vegetation. So it could be possible to develop solar in a way that maintains the habitat for tortoises. But folks are trying to figure that out.
Does elevation come into play with the different types? Example of Colorado and say Palm Springs.
I don't know if I understand the question.
Well, wouldn't it,
So-
like the Colorado area would be 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher in elevation
Mhm.
as opposed to the Palm Springs area? So-
Oh, so are you asking if that plays a difference in genetic structure?
Yes.
Yeah, it does. So high elevation mountain ranges cause reduced gene flow. However, there are some mountain passes in high elevation mountain ranges where we have found high levels of connectivity for tortoises. It still restricts it. So what we generally find with tortoises is a pattern where valleys have some substructuring with evidence of gene flow up through mountain passes. But it is the high elevation mountains, and then those low floors, the low playas that create natural population genetic structure across the range. Yeah. So we might find more differences if these tortoises are studied more extensively, which I hope they are. Yeah.
What's the
sorry.
what's the primary predator of the tortoise?
Oh my gosh, everything when they're little. They're delicious. So tortoises don't develop a hard shell until they're about 5 years old. Badgers will eat adult tortoises. Badgers are strong enough to actually tear the carapace from the plastron and divide them into 2. Coyotes predate tortoises, ravens, young tortoises. So there are a lot of natural predators for desert tortoises. And ravens are a little bit of an interesting species because they are native in the desert Southwest, but they're a subsidized predator. So we've increased their population density.
Really?
And we've also allowed them lots and lots of access into more remote areas. Every time we build a power line, that's nesting habitat for a raven.
Interesting.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Are the eggs attended in any way, or are they just?
Not that I know of. I don't think they're attended in any way. They are laid in the apron of the burrow, or there are some reports from the Palm Springs area that they're laid deeper in the burrow, but I don't think there's any, once the female lays the eggs, I don't think there's really any attendance or maternal care provided. Yes?
I found a tortoise shell out hiking. How old could that be?
You mean how long has it been dead, or how old was the individual when it died?
No, yeah. How long do you think the shell could have been there after he died?
Was it all white bone, or were there scoots was the brown stuff on it?
Yeah, a lot of brown still on it.
It's hard for me to say without taking a look at it. It can be sort of tough to gauge that accurately, but generally what happens after a tortoise dies is something that dies naturally or gets hit by a car. Something comes and eats its head, because that apparently is the tastiest part. You very rarely find a tortoise with the head on it. And then it starts to dry out and desiccate. So if it's very fresh, it would still have fresh tissue, but over time, that will disappear and you'll end up with a hollowed out shell. The longer it sits in the sun, the more baked the shell becomes, and the scutes are the things on the top that have the rings on them, and they're made out of keratin, so similarly to like a fingernail, and they're attached to the bone underneath, and so eventually those will start to pop off. To accurately age how long it's been out there is pretty tough though, because if it's in a shaded area or an area where it was exposed to more moisture, it'll be preserved for longer, right? As opposed to being out there cooked in the sun. So it's tough for me to say how long that tortoise has been there.
How do you determine the age? By the size of the shell?
Yeah, that's a tricky one too. So tortoises have, like all reptiles, have indeterminate growth, so they grow for their entire life. So we call an adult tortoise anything that's over 180 millimeters, and between 120 and 180 is called a subadult. And generally speaking, once you get to 180, you're probably looking at a tortoise that's, you are looking at a tortoise that's probably reached sexual maturity and is probably 15 to 20 years old. But it also depends on how they're living, right? So you could take a tortoise and put it in your backyard and feed it and power feed that thing and turn it into a big beastly animal by the time it's 5 or 6. It still wouldn't reach sexual maturity. Or you can have areas with smaller tortoises because they're just not getting the same nutrition. And in fact, I think it was in Jeff Manning's report from his Anza-Borrego tortoises that they appeared to be smaller on average than what you would expect, which sort of makes sense if you're living in marginal habitat and maybe not getting as many resources. So we have a few numbers that we use, that 120 cutoff and 180 cutoff, but really aging a tortoise is another tricky business. Yes?
I have a question about the monitors you attach to them. You're
Okay.
saying the young ones don't have a hard shell, so are you limited in age-wise as to who you can stick these monitors on?
Yeah, generally they have to be over 120 millimeters. So when tortoises move, when tortoises hatch and then they move, we're reasonably sure, but we're not entirely sure that they're only going short distances, like 100 to 200 meters, because often you can find the eggshell fragments in a nearby burrow when you find a little bitty guy. They undergo a dispersal period when they're somewhere around that 120 millimeter mark and possibly before, and they go places. We don't know where they go or how far they go because they're too small to attach equipment. So around that 120 mark, we can attach radio and track them, but often they'll take off and they'll go outside of the range, and we tend to lose those animals. So it's hard to know where they're going during that dispersal period and how far they're going, but they could be going pretty far or not. We don't know for sure. But the adults are the ones that we can attach radio transmitters onto and those data loggers. And the radio transmitter lasts for about 2 years, and the data logger we swap out every month. But yeah. Yes.
Do you have an estimate of population size in the state park here?
No. But that's a good question. And that's something that would be really interesting to study. So population density studies have been done throughout the range of the tortoise, and they generally require repeat measures in the same area, in a 1 square kilometer area. But they haven't been done here. Again, it's outside of the recovery units. So the Fish and Wildlife Service Desert Tortoise Recovery Office hasn't looked at this area. Yes.
Do you tag all of the ones that you find so you can keep track of them?
Yeah, so most of the time they're tagged. So in the studies that I worked on, we always tagged our tortoises so that we would make sure that we weren't collecting a sample from another tortoise. And tagging is, it's a little paper tag, and we used to put these notches in the shell with a file where we file into their shell and for the number system. And now we use a little bit of this stuff called quick steel to attach it to the edge of the shell. It's a little less traumatic for the tortoise. I mean, filing into their shell a little bit doesn't hurt, but you have to sit there and file into their shell. And I kind of forgot where I was going with that. The tagging, oh yeah. So it's nice to tag them. One of my colleagues, Todd Eskew with USGS over in Nevada, he has been working on tortoises, I think, since the early 80s. And we were out on survey one day, this was maybe about 5-6 years ago, and the crew found a tortoise with an old tag, and it was a tortoise he had tagged 30 years ago, which was really cool because he was able to go into the records and see where she was and then and where she is now, and it was a very happy reunion. But there are some projects out there, like my colleague Anjana, her range-wide project for tortoises, they didn't tag any of their animals. So they went out to one area, it was just supposed to be a one-and-done genetic sample and no long-term studies, so they didn't.
So is anybody tagging the ones here?
Jeff Manning tagged the ones here, and when the state park released pet tortoises here, they apparently put painted big white numbers on their shells.
What are the determining characteristics between male and female?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked because I have a slide right here. So this is cut off a little bit. This is a male. So males have this really extended gular projection that they use to flip other males. They also have these chin glands right here, these swollen chin glands that contain pheromones. Males also have a concave plastron, so that's something that you probably wouldn't see if you're not, unless you're handling the tortoise, unless you get down and look, but they have a concave plastron. Adult females have a shorter gular right there, so it's not this long projection. They don't have the chin glands, and their plastron is flat. Interestingly, this female right here lost a leg, so she was a 3-legged tortoise, and she seemed to be fine because we found her every single year for like 6 years in a row on these surveys. I don't know who took her leg, but.
Oh, it's pretty easy to determine.
Once they reach sexual maturity, yeah, it's pretty easy.
On average, how many tortoises that you study and handle lose their bladder?
Oh boy, I don't have a solid number for that, but when we're working with tortoises, we're only allowed to handle tortoises for 30 minutes. When we get blood from a tortoise, we're only allowed to try 3 sticks. If you don't get it on the 3rd time, you're done for 24 hours. You can come back the next day if you can find it and try again. And you're not allowed to touch a tortoise above 95 degrees. So there are very strict protocols in place for handling tortoises to reduce their stress. If a tortoise does void its bladder, we have several mechanisms for rehydration. We can use a syringe with a clean water bottle, not a water bottle that has ever been drunk out of. So a clean water bottle, and we can drip it down onto their nose, and sometimes they'll drink that way. We can also inject water into their coelomic cavity, which is sort of like the big opening cavity where organs are held inside that cavity, but that's a little bit more specialized. So we have ways of rehydrating them, and then there are some projects where folks will carry around a tote and water, and they'll soak them in a tote for 30 minutes, because tortoises can absorb water through their cloaca as well. Yes?
What do tortoises contribute to the environment such that if they're no longer here, what would change in the environment?
Everything.
That's a really good question. So sometimes people call tortoises a keystone species. I don't know if that's necessarily true. It could be. Tortoises do create burrows that are used by a lot of other organisms. So I've seen tortoises, I'm not the only person, this is very well documented, tortoises sharing burrows with burrowing owls, which can't dig their own burrows, and sharing them with rattlesnakes. So their burrows are shared with a number of other species. And when you're living in such an arid environment, having that burrow structure is very, very important for a lot of things other than tortoises. Now, if tortoises were to disappear on the environment, from the environment entirely, there are a lot of negative implications to that, and one of them could be the loss of that burrow structure, which creates habitat for many other species. They also can disperse seeds because they're obligate herbivores, and they're eating a lot of annual plants during the blooms, and they eat a lot of flowering plants and fruits that they then walk around and disperse on the landscape. So there's also predator-prey dynamics that could be impacted. Yeah, so there are a lot, but I think of tortoises mostly as an umbrella species, right? So in order to conserve a habitat or a species, it needs to have a certain level of popularity. This is the reason that there are not a lot of snakes or rattlesnakes on the endangered species list, right? So you need something that's charismatic. And in terms of the reptile world, like, what's better than this? You know, it's super duper cute. And because they're really well connected across the landscape and they have these large home ranges, if you can protect habitat for the tortoise, you're actually going to protect habitat for a lot of other things, not just native animals, but also native plants. Yes.
The burrows that they give. Okay, if they're in their home area and they have a burrow, that's pretty clear. But when they're traveling a long distance, what do they do during the nights and?
They go to other burrows. So tortoise connectivity has been described as a network of burrows. It's a burrow system. And so tortoises change burrows a lot. So they have winter burrows and summer burrows and fall burrows and burrows where they hang out with a lot of other tortoises and burrows where they hang out to be by themselves. So they move around a lot on the landscape. And as their home range, that 1 square kilometer home range, it's not static. It's not like for the entire lifespan of this animal, that is its 1 square kilometer home range. Often they shift a little over time, right? And within that home range, they have a network of sometimes dozens of burrows.
Are they social?
Yeah, so reptiles generally are considered not social, and tortoises have been considered not social, but there's some studies on tortoise connectivity, I think by someone named Praha Saw from Penn State, looked at tortoise burrows to evaluate how often they share, how often they switch, and how often they share burrows. And she found that tortoises actually share burrows a lot more than we would expect. And when you hang out with tortoises enough, you'll see that I feel like they're like me. They really value their time alone, but sometimes they like to go out and hang out with other tortoises and bob their heads around and walk around in circles and have a good time.
I do have a question about, you know, a lot of us go on a hike and I've seen tortoise, like you said, a coyote canyon.
You've seen tortoises?
I like coyote.
Oh my gosh.
So the question is, so here we are, and at one time, you know, I actually tell people, because I volunteer at the visitor center, if you see one, don't touch it.
Don't touch it.
Take a picture your GPS is on, and we'll send it to Danny. You know, well, you weren't here then. This is Danny. He saw one. He brought it into the visitor center.
I've never seen a tortoise in Anza-Borrego.
Oh, yeah.
Really?
No.
They're out of Piñon, right? Is that what you found it?
It was in Harbor Flat.
Harbor Flat, not
I
Piñon.
don't even know where that is.
I had one in my neighborhood at the Anza.
Oh, well, that's something else.
No, and then out of county, way out, you have to hike there now, past, this, no, way past Third. Yeah, up in the Collins Valley we saw them. But the point is we try to educate people, but if we see a shell, that's been, do you take pictures in GPS and just leave it there?
Yeah, you wanna leave the shell there,
yeah.
because there's again that risk that you're spreading disease around when you.
We're not supposed to touch it anyway.
Yeah, you're not supposed to
Okay.
touch it anyway.
But the point is we're, besides sending it to you, but we should tell people to bring it to the park with the GPSs and the pictures, and then send it out. I mean, Danny was ecstatic when he sent the picture in. And so that's what we tell people. we
Yeah,
see
if they see it, they can take a picture or give me a location, or
Yeah,
Danny, me and Danny though.
you should, don't just send it to Dan, send it
I
to.
mean, you can.
Yeah.
But then I have to bother Danny to give me the point.
Okay,
He got the
Yeah.
one that we found.
yeah, we sent it.
He
yeah.
did?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was what, last,
It was in the fall,
yeah, we were last, because they wandered
maybe
in,
the winter.
and they came in and go, I kind of saw this, and was like, oh my God, like I'm jumped in.
That's so exciting. How big was it?
And
Oh, yeah, that's
It was
nice.
about that big.
Your tortoise,
And
that's too
I-
big.
Well, actually, I've seen,
Not yours.
oh.
Yours is the right size.
Also, out, Wrangle Way, that area,
Yeah.
from town. And, just on the edge, the edge of where the houses are.
Do you have a picture?
Pardon me?
Do you have a picture? Sorry, I didn't.
I would have to look. My phone's in my car right
There are a lot of different species of tortoise that are popular in the pet trade, and the size, like this size makes me think it's something else.
Sulcata.
Yeah, sulcata. But, because that's, it's a big desert tortoise. This is probably.
now. Well, maybe, I'm probably exaggerating.
Well, sure. But pictures help a lot, especially if it's of the carapace, and if you can see that front, this part right here, this thing right here, okay, this, right here. Mojave desert tortoises have that. Sulcatas do not. So these two marginals come in and meet in like a little V.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that's how you can tell those two species apart.
We saw one in Joshua Tree as well.
The desert tortoise, yeah, that's good habitat over there. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you guys so much, it was a real privilege.